Hello class, it's Sunday morning, March 15, 2020. This is session number 11 of our Maccabees class at Adams Boulevard Church of Christ, COVID-19 edition. Contagion and fear are spreading across the land, so instead of presenting this at the church building like I usually do, I'm recording this in a hermetically sealed, germ-free bunker and recording studio in an unnamed location. If you want the usual class experience, then I suggest you watch a few cat videos on YouTube, then ring your doorbell before proceeding. I'm not sure how this recorded class is going to be made available, but in case you don't know how to find the class web page, here's the address. Audio from all previous classes except for class number 9 can be found here. However, as of right now, this is the only recorded class that also includes the slides. I'm going to take just a few minutes to back up and summarize some of what we covered last week. We talked about a new player who entered the stage named Demetrius Soter, and he was the son of Seleucus IV, who had been king of the Seleucid Empire at one time, but his son Demetrius had been sent to Rome to serve as a hostage during the time that the terms of a treaty with Rome was being implemented. Demetrius was just a young boy at the time. He was held hostage there until he was 25 years old, when he escaped his captors, made his way back to the lands of the Seleucid Empire, raised an army overnight, and went to war with the regent at the time, Lysias, and Demetrius's 9-year-old nephew, who was officially serving as king of the Seleucid Empire at the time, Antiochus V. Demetrius was victorious. His army defeated the army of Lysias. Lysias and the 9-year-old boy, Antiochus V, were captured. Demetrius had them both executed. So now Demetrius is effectively king of the Seleucid Empire, and at this point, a man by the name of Alcimus, who is a direct descendant of Aaron, he makes a play for becoming the high priest at the temple. So he goes to Demetrius, tells him, I'm your guy, I'm the one who should be serving as high priest, I will be loyal to you. And this guy, Judas Maccabees, he's caused all sorts of trouble, so you need to get rid of him. So you should send an army with me, and we will remove Judas, and the land of Judea will be peaceful and obedient to you. Demetrius is convinced of this, so he hires a military governor by the name of Maccabees to lead an army and to take Alcimus with them to go to Jerusalem and do battle with Judas and his forces. When they get to Jerusalem with this huge army, Alcimus and Bacchides sends messengers to Judas and says, hey, we're just here for peaceful reasons, we just want to talk. Well, Judas doesn't believe this, won't meet with them, but the Hasidians, who were in alliance with Judas, and we've talked about them before, they decided that they do believe that peace can be had. I think at this point they're just tired of all the fighting. They think that since Alcimus is a direct descendant of Aaron, that he has a legitimate claim to be high priest. They think that even if he's going to be loyal to Demetrius, he will do what a high priest is supposed to do, that the sacrifices will continue, that the law will be observed. So they decide to make peace and allow Alcimus to be the high priest. Judas and his men kind of leave the scene. They withdraw outside the city. So now Demetrius's forces are in control of Jerusalem. But as soon as they get control, the Hasidians, who they made peace with, Bacchides and Alchemists, well, primarily Alchemists, gives the order to have 60 of the top Hasidians executed. Not a very smart political move. Of course, it angers all the Jews in Judea. And according to the author of First Maccabees, this execution of these 60 Hasidians fulfills prophecy of Psalm chapter 79 through 3. They have given the dead bodies of your servants for food to the birds of the heavens, the flesh of your godly ones to the beasts of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water round about Jerusalem, and there was no one to bury them. So, of course, the godly ones, the author of First Maccabees is claiming that that's a reference to the Hasidians. The word Hasidian means pious one or godly one. So he thinks that execution of 60 of them was a fulfillment of this prophecy. Well, Judas and his men, they resume their guerrilla-style attacks like they were doing in the very beginning of the revolt. This makes it very difficult for Alchemists to rule. Really, he just has control of Jerusalem and not any of the outlying cities and towns. So Alchemist returns to Demetrius in Antioch and asks for more military support. He tells them that what Judas is doing is making it impossible for us to have peace here. You need to do something about this. Once again, Demetrius listens to Alchemist, and so he orders that another army be assembled to do battle with Judas, and this time he puts in charge Nicanor. And we have talked about Nicanor once before, so this is actually going to be a rematch between Judas and Nicanor. And last week I mentioned something else I learned about Nicanor, which I didn't find in First Maccabees. I found elsewhere, but I just love the fact that his official title is Elephantarch, and that's because in his army he had a lot of elephants. So he was Master of Elephants, or Elephantarch, which is a title that I definitely aspire to. Someday I want to be Rip Tucker Elephantarch Esquire. So Nicanor the Elephantarch is ordered to go against Judas, and last time he went against Judas, it was a colossal defeat. If you'll recall, early on in the class we talked about that battle. It was really the first real official battle between Judas and his new army and the forces of the Seleucids. Up until then, there had just been a couple of ambush attacks that Judas had made, but at this time an army was assembled with the intention of going against Judas. Judas and his men are encamped on one side of the battlefield and the Seleucid forces on the other. The Seleucid forces, they were led by three generals, Gorgias, Nicanor, and Ptolemy. And this is the one where the slave traders showed up on the scene because they were so sure that Judas and his men were going to be wiped out. They wanted to be there to purchase all these captured Jewish prisoners from the Seleucids at the end of the battle. And it didn't work out that way. So the Seleucids were completely wiped out. The general Gorgias was killed, and the slave traders had to flee for their lives, and Judas and his men captured all the gold and wealth that the slave traders had. But Nicanor, he survived that day, and he made it back to Antioch, and now here we are many years later, and Nicanor is still one of the generals, even though his former king is no longer with us. Now we have a new king, Demetrius. Okay, so Nicanor and his new army, he arrives in Jerusalem, and Nicanor and his new army arrives in Jerusalem. Nicanor then sends messengers to Judas, inviting him to come have a meeting with Nicanor, a meeting of peace. And Judas agrees and meets with Nicanor. But here is where the account in 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees really diverge. According to 1st Maccabees, this was a trap, and Nicanor had men in hiding waiting to capture Judas. For whatever reason, the trap didn't work. They had the meeting, but Judas left without being harmed in any way. But Judas did perceive that this was a trap, and so he wouldn't meet with Nicanor after that. According to 2nd Maccabees, Nicanor was sincere about having this peaceful meeting, and in fact, other meetings between the two men followed. Nicanor developed a sort of respect for Judas and his military leadership, and they became friendly. And it says that Nicanor didn't want to engage in battle with Judas, his friend. And in fact, it was Nicanor who advised to Judas that it's time that he settle down and get married, and that Judas follows this advice from his enemy and marries, settles down, and has kids. Very bizarre. But according to both 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Alchemist, the high priest, didn't like the fact that Nicanor wasn't doing anything, wasn't going to battle with Judas. So he goes back to Demetrius and kind of tells on Nicanor, says that you sent him to Jerusalem to do battle with Judas, but he's not doing anything. So Demetrius, he sends an order to Nicanor that says that you engage Judas and his men in battle. That's what I sent you to do. So Nicanor reluctantly does this. The first thing he does is he provokes a battle outside of Jerusalem. But this was a mistake because Judas's forces were ready, and once again they were victorious over the Seleucid forces. They end up killing 500 of Nicanor's soldiers. The next move Nicanor makes is he goes to the Temple Mount and he confronts the priest, even though they are loyal to Alchemist and they're loyal to Demetrius. In fact, when Nicanor shows up at the temple, the priests come out and tell him that we sacrifice every day for the king because we are loyal to Demetrius. And Nicanor doesn't receive this well. In fact, he spits on them, intentionally making them unclean. And he raises his right arm towards the temple and he vows to level the temple and to erect a temple of Dionysus if they don't deliver Judas to him. The priests, they weep, they pray to God, asking for vengeance against Nicanor for this insult and sacrilege. And they pray for preservation of the Lord's house. And that's the prayer that you're seeing on the slide now in 2nd Maccabees chapter 14, verses 34 to 36. It says that the priests stretched out their hands toward heaven, calling upon the unfailing defender of our nation in these words: Lord of all, though you are in need of nothing, you were pleased to have a temple for your dwelling place among us. Therefore, Holy One, Lord of all holiness, preserve forever undefiled this house, which has been so recently purified. So once again, we see there use of Old Testament language referring to the temple as God's dwelling place. Well, Nicanor moves forward with going to battle with Judas, but at this point in 2nd Maccabees, it takes a break to give another martyrdom account, and I can't resist reading this one. Once again, since we're in 2nd Maccabees, you know that we're going to have some gore. And we find this one in 2nd Maccabees chapter 14. And I'm going to start with verse 37, and I'm going to read to the end. A certain Razis, one of the elders of Jerusalem, was denounced to Nicanor as a patriot, A man highly regarded, he was called a father of the Jews because of his good will towards them. So this language makes it sound like he's probably not a Jew himself, he's probably a convert. In the days before the revolt, he had been convicted of being a Jew and had risked body and soul in his ardent zeal for Judaism. Nicanor, to show his disdain for the Jews, sent more than 500 soldiers to arrest him. He thought that by arresting that man he would deal the Jews a hard blow. But when the troops, on the point of capturing the tower, was forcing the outer gate and calling for fire to be set to the door, Raziz, now caught on all sides, turned his sword against himself, preferring to die nobly rather than fall into the hands of vile men and suffer outrages unworthy of his noble birth. In the excitement of the struggle, he failed to strike exactly. So while the troops rushed in through the doors, he gallantly ran up to the top of the wall and courageously threw himself down into the crowd. But as they quickly drew back and left an opening, he fell into the middle of the empty space. So you have to understand the scene here. So he tries to stab himself, but he doesn't do it right. So then he runs up to the top of his tower and jumps off like doing a stage dive at a rock concert or something. But instead of landing on the people down below, they all scatter because they see this guy with a sword stuck in him, blood coming out. They go, ooh, and they all scatter, and he splats in the middle. But it continues. He's not dead. Still breathing and inflamed with anger, he got up and ran through the crowd with blood gushing from his frightful wounds. Then, standing on a steep rock, as he lost the last of his blood, he tore out his entrails and flung them with both hands into the crowd, calling upon the Lord of life and of spirit to give these back to him again. Such was the manner of his death. So just a very bizarre martyrdom account. I read that in part just because it's so bizarre, but also we see once again an example of somebody dying in 2 Maccabees who is able to face death because of their confidence in the resurrection. So that's once again that's a transition we're seeing from what we see in the Old Testament to the New Testament, with this increasing belief and anticipation of resurrection, not just resurrection, but a bodily resurrection. Something else to consider when when talking about the death of Raziz is that when I researched this online, I discovered that really how to view this man is debated among Jews, debated among rabbis, and has been over the centuries. Some view him as a courageous martyr, and others think that he's just a lunatic, and that he should not be revered because he didn't fight the enemy to the death. He chose suicide rather than to engage the enemy, and that's something shameful. So we can think that this same sort of debate was probably going on in the first century when Jesus is executed on the cross. So we can have to wonder what people were thinking at the time about Jesus's own execution. We know that it was hard for some to accept that Jesus would be the Messiah, because anybody who's hung on a tree, executed like Jesus was, is accursed according to the Old Testament. And if Jesus is the Messiah, why would he endure this? Why would he allow himself to go to the cross? It's almost like he's committing suicide, like Raziz. So some would have difficulty accepting this, just like they have a hard time accepting Raziz as being somebody that we should revere as a courageous martyr. Well, getting back to the main story, Nicanor and his forces doing battle with Judas, what happens is that Nicanor gathers a new force outside of Jerusalem to battle Judas. Judas only has 3,000 men. He's greatly outnumbered. So before going into battle, he offers this prayer. This is in 1 Maccabees chapter 7, verses 41 and 42. When they who were sent by the king blasphemed, your angel went out and killed 185,000 of them. In the same way, crush this army before us today, and let the rest know that Nicanor spoke wickedly against your sanctuary. Judge him according to his wickedness. So he's referring back to something that we've read about in the Old Testament. He's referring to the expedition of Sennacherib against Jerusalem in 701 BC, when the Judean forces were vastly outnumbered, but miraculously rescued by the angel of the Lord. We read that in 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 32 through 35. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there, and he will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return, and he shall not come to this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Judas knows the history of his people, and he's praying to God that he will deliver them once again, just like he did from the forces of Sennacherib. Well, something else that happens just before battle, Judas encourages his men by telling them about a, quote, waking vision worthy of belief that he had. What he sees in this vision is he sees Onias praying for the Jewish people. Now, in case you don't remember who Onias is, he was the last really good high priest. Remember, he was the high priest that did everything right. He observed the law, did all the sacrifices like they were supposed to be done. The people respected him, and he had the right bloodline. He was a direct descendant of Aaron, so he served as high priest in a proper manner in accordance with the law, and he was really the last high priest that we can say that about. And at this point, of course, he's deceased, and Judas has this vision. He sees Onias with his hands stretched out, and he's saying this prayer for all the Jewish people. And then Judas sees a distinguished man with white hair, that he appears, and Onias then introduces him to Judas as the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah hands Judas a gold sword and tells him to accept this gift from God and to use it to shatter his enemies. So this is a little bit like the transfiguration that we read about later on in Luke chapter 9, verses 29 through 32. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. So here, instead of seeing the Old Testament prophet Elijah, Judas sees the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. So he tells his men about this, and so that they will be assured that God has promised them victory. And sure enough, God answers the prayer of Judas. Judas's plan is to weaken the army by taking out Nicanor right at the beginning of the battle, and this works. So Nicanor is killed, and the Seleucid army goes into full retreat. Judas's men sound the trumpets, and other faithful Jews, all in the area, answer the call. So this is as Nicanor's forces are retreating away from Jerusalem. All these other Jews in these villages around Jerusalem all come out answering the call of Judas to help chase down and kill the remaining elements of Nicanor's army. So the Seleucid army is completely wiped out here. And when it's all over, Judas's men, they find Nicanor's body. And this is how 2nd Maccabees ends, is with the death of Nicanor. And I'm going to read 2nd Maccabees chapter 15, verse 30 to the end of the chapter. Then Judas, that man who was ever in body and soul the chief defender of his fellow citizens, and had maintained from youth his affection for his compatriots, ordered Nicanor's head and right arm up to the shoulder to be cut off and taken to Jerusalem. When he arrived there, he assembled his compatriots, stationed the priests before the altar, and sent for those in the citadel. He showed them the vile Nicanor's head and the wretched blasphemer's arm that had been boastfully stretched out against the holy dwelling of the Almighty. He cut out the tongue of the godless Nicanor, saying he would feed it piecemeal to the birds, and would hang up the other wages of his folly opposite the temple. At this, everyone looked toward heaven and praised the Lord who manifested himself. Blessed be the one who has preserved undefiled his own place. Judas hung Nicanor's head and arm on the wall of the citadel, a clear and evident sign to all of the Lord's help. By public vote, it was unanimously decreed never to let this day pass unobserved, but to celebrate the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar in Aramaic, the eve of Mordecai's day. Okay, so why did Judas tack Nicanor's head and right arm onto the citadel? Well, if you'll remember, the citadel is that Seleucid fortress that got built right on the Temple Mount, right by the temple. And believe it or not, even now, it's still being controlled by Seleucid soldiers. So these Seleucid soldiers are holed up inside, and Judas, he's basically saying, hey, I got a message here from your boss, Nicanor. So he brings out the head and arm of Nicanor and tacks them right onto the citadel with the remaining Seleucid soldiers still inside. So why the head and right arm? Well, I read in one place that this is a Persian custom to cut off the head and right arm of your enemy, but the text explains the real reason why. Remember, Nicanor raised his right arm against the temple, and then he promised that he would level the temple and replace it with the temple to Dionysus. So he spoke against the temple and raised his right arm against the temple, so that right arm was cut off, and his head was cut off, and his tongue fed to the birds, the same tongue that he used to speak against the temple. And if you'll remember, I explained that really the main theme running throughout the account of 2nd Maccabees is God's protection of the temple. So it's appropriate that this is how 2nd Maccabees ends, is with once again God protecting his dwelling place, and the pagan enemy of God's people is dealt with and punished for his attempt to act against the temple. Okay, so what is Mordecai's Day, and what does it celebrate? The second Maccabees says that this new holiday of Nicanor's Day is going to be on the eve of Mordecai's Day. So what is Mordecai's Day? Well, that's just another name for Purim. We read about the origin of Purim in the book of Esther. But before going there, let's just look once again at how Second Maccabees ends with its reference to Mordecai's Day. That's here it is. It's Second Maccabees chapter 15, verses 34 and 36. At this, everyone looked toward heaven and praised the Lord who manifests himself. Blessed be the one who has preserved undefiled his own place. Judas hung Nicanor's head and arm on the wall of the citadel, a clear and evident sign to all of the Lord's help. By public vote, it was unanimously decreed never to let this day pass unobserved, but to celebrate the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar in Aramaic. There's a typo there. The eve of Mordecai's Day. Okay, to revisit Esther, we go to chapter 9, verses 26 through 31, and that's where it tells us about the establishment of Purim. Therefore, these days were called Purim from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family, and in every province, and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. So you can see the similarities here. So the end of Second Maccabees brings forward a parallel between the purpose of the book of Esther and that of Second Maccabees, which is the saving of the Jews. So Nicanor's Day would be celebrated as a Jewish holiday the day before Mordecai Day, all the way through the 1st century and all the way up until probably 7 AD is when the last time we really read about Nicanor's Day being celebrated on a regular basis. But in any account, we can be certain that during the 1st century, Nicanor's Day was still being observed. So Jesus and his apostles would have very much been aware of Nicanor's Day and the story of Judas and his defeat of Nicanor and his forces as part of God's actions to preserve the temple, his dwelling place. And First Maccabees gives the same account of this defeat of Nicanor, and that's in chapter 7 of First Maccabees. And then it concludes this account by saying, and so for a few days the land of Judah was at rest. And what I like about this is it's clearly trying to use the language that we see in Judges, that at the end of the account of each of the judges it would say something similar, except it would always be years. It'd say something like, and for 40 years there was peace in the land. But here the writer of First Maccabees says, and so for a few days the land of Judah was at rest. So it's harken back to Judges but with a little bit of humor, because he's saying that there's going to be a few days of rest instead of a few years of rest. And indeed, that's what happens. There's only a few days of rest, and then the fighting resumes. And Judas knew that there would only be a few days of peace. He knew that Demetrius would send another army against him. So in anticipation of that, Judas decided that he needed an alliance. So he sought an alliance with Rome. You heard me right, Rome. This is probably one of the biggest shocks that I got when I first read First Maccabees, is when I get to this part and I see that Judas, our Jewish hero, is seeking an alliance with Rome, the same Rome that would end up putting Jesus on a cross and then destroying the temple in 70 AD. But to be fair, I would remind you that we're talking about two different Romes at this time. This was before Caesar, so this isn't the Roman Empire. This is still the Roman Republic. Still, this is Rome. This is what Rome looked like at the time. This is the territory that it covered. You see that it's in the green. That shows what the Roman Republic was in 201 BC. And then you'll see in the orange what it would become just 100 years later in 100 BC. And of course, at this point in our story of Maccabees, we're in about 160 BC. It is in the 8th chapter of First Maccabees that we read about Judas seeking an alliance with Rome, and this is how it begins. This is verses 1 and 2. It says, Judas had heard of the reputation of the Romans. They were valiant fighters and acted amiably to all who took their side. They established a friendly alliance with all who applied to them. He was also told of their battles and the brave deeds that they performed against the Gauls, conquering them and forcing them to pay tribute, and what they did in Spain to get possession of the silver and gold mines there. And it just goes on for several paragraphs in glowing terms about how great Rome is. And the basic message is Rome is victorious over its enemies and it's good to its friends. So it's saying that it's a good move on Judas's part to seek to have Rome as an ally. And I just have to wonder if maybe this is one reason why First and Second Maccabees never made it into the Jewish Old Testament. Because remember when it was being decided what book should be in and what should be out, this would have been in 1st and 2nd century AD. So Rome's not well thought of by the Jews at this time, so it might be a little bit awkward for them to make part of their Bible an account of Judas, this hero of the Jews, seeking an alliance with Rome and describing them in such glowing terms. But that's what happens. And so Judas, he sends family members to Rome to make this alliance. And we read about that in First Maccabees chapter 8, verse 17. Now I'll read all the way to the end of the chapter because this includes the text of the treaty that they make with Rome, which is pretty important. Starting with verse 17. So Judas chose Eupolemus, son of John, son of Achos, and Jason, son of Eleazar, and sent them to Rome to establish friendship and alliance with them. He did this to lift the yoke from Israel, for it was obvious that the kingdom of the Greeks was subjecting them to slavery. After making a very long journey to Rome, the envoys entered the Senate chamber and spoke as follows. Judas, called Maccabees, and his brothers with the Jewish people have sent us to you to establish alliance and peace with you, and to be enrolled among your allies and friends. The proposal pleased the Romans, and this is a copy of the reply that they inscribed on bronze tablets and sent to Jerusalem to remain there with the Jews as a record of peace and alliance. May it well be with the Romans and the Jewish nation at sea and on land forever. May sword and enemy be far from them. But if war is first made on Rome or any of its allies in any of their dominions, the Jewish nation will fight along with them wholeheartedly, as the occasion shall demand. And to those who wage war, they shall not give or provide grain, weapons, money, or ships, as seems best to Rome. They shall fulfill their obligations without receiving any recompense. In the same way, if war is made first on the Jewish nation, the Romans will fight along with them willingly, as the occasion shall demand. And to those who attack them, there shall not be given grain, weapons, money, or ships, as seems best to Rome. They shall fulfill their obligations without deception. On these terms, the Romans have made an agreement with the Jewish people. But if both parties hereafter agree to add or take away anything, they shall do as they choose, and whatever they shall add or take away shall be valid. Moreover, concerning the wrongs that King Demetrius is doing to them, we have written to them thus: Why have you made your yoke heavy upon our friends and allies, the Jews? If they petition against you again, we will enforce justice and make war on you by sea and land. Now, modern scholars, they believe that this treaty is authentic, except for that last part about Demetrius. And they think that the bronze Latin version of the treaty, that would have remained in Rome, but a copy in Aramaic, Hebrew, or possibly Greek would have been taken back to Jerusalem. Now, nothing would come of this alliance until after Judas's death, but the treaty served political purposes on both sides. And as I was reading it, you probably picked up on the fact that there's plenty of loopholes in there. Rome is only going to act as seems appropriate to Rome, and it says either side could change the treaty if they really want to. So Rome's really not committing to doing anything, but it serves political purposes. It helps them in having an alliance, at least on paper, with Demetrius's enemies, because Demetrius is Rome's enemy, and it helps Judas to have this alliance on paper. And it also, just the fact that Judas's family members went to Rome and came back with this treaty, that legitimizes them as the government. I mean, they're acting like a nation state now, with envoys going to a foreign power and coming back with a treaty. But in any event, the treaty doesn't have any immediate effect. It doesn't have any immediate deterrent against Demetrius. It's just like Judas anticipated. Demetrius raises another army, and once again, it is being led by Maccabees and Alchemists, the wicked high priest. They take this new army and head for Jerusalem, and this would be about 160 BC. And this is to avenge Nicanor. Maccabees has 20,000 soldiers and 2,000 cavalry, and that's against Judas's 3,000 men. So hugely outnumbered. And Judas wouldn't even have 3,000 for very long, because as Judas's men sees Maccabees' army assembling, and see the overwhelming odds that they're up against, they become fearful. They start to desert and go back home. So seeing these overwhelming odds, many in Judas's army leave, and so Judas ends up with only about 800 men. that he decides to fight on, hoping that just by not fleeing, that somehow this is going to be a surprise to Bacchides' army, and if Judas can act quickly and can strike at Bacchides himself and take him out, then maybe Bacchides' army will fall into chaos and Judas will have a chance. So think about this again. We have 20,000 soldiers, 2,000 cavalry against Judas's 800. So if you're starting to think of the Spartans battling at Thermopylae, you're on the right track. And unfortunately for Judas, it's going to end in the same way that it ended for the Spartans. First Maccabees chapter 9 gives a pretty detailed account of this battle, and I'm going to read that starting with verse 7. I'm going to go all the way to the end of the chapter. When Judas saw that his army was melting away just as the battle was imminent, he was broken-hearted, because he had no time to gather them together. In spite of his discouragement, he said to those who remained, "Let us go forward to meet our enemies. Perhaps we can put up a good fight against them." They tried to dissuade him, saying, "We certainly cannot. Let us save our own lives now and come back with our kindred, and then fight against them. Now we are too few." But Judas said, "Far be it from me to do such a thing as to flee from them. If our time has come, let us die bravely for our kindred and not leave a stain upon our honor." Then the army of Bacchides moved out of camp and took its position for combat. The cavalry were divided into 2 squadrons, and the slingers and the archers came on ahead of the army, and in the front line were all the best warriors. Bacchides was on the right wing, flanked by the 2 squadrons. The phalanx attacked as they blew their trumpets. Those who were on Judas's side also blew their trumpets. The earth shook with the noise of the armies, and the battle raged from morning until evening. When Judas saw that Bacchides was on the right with the main force of his army, all the most stout-hearted rallied to him, and the right wing was crushed. Judas pursued them as far as the mountain slopes, but when those on the left wing saw that the right wing was crushed, they closed in behind Judas and those with him. The battle became intense, and many on both sides fell wounded. Then Judas fell, and the rest fled. Jonathan and Simon took their brother Judas and buried him in the tomb of their ancestors at Modain. All Israel wept for him with great lamentation. They mourned for him many days, and they said, "How the mighty one has fallen, the Savior of Israel." The other acts of Judas, his battles, the brave deeds he performed, and his greatness have not been recorded, but they were many. So Judas dies a biblical hero described in familiar language. We see an example of this. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 25. "How have the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan is slain on your high places." So it's the same language. There it was Jonathan was the mighty. Here it is Judas who is the mighty. So once again, if we were making a movie, this would be a good place to roll the credits, although this would be clearly a more somber ending. Judas fell in battle, dying a hero's death. So that brings us to the end of the story of Judas Maccabeus, but it's not the end of the story of the Maccabees and the Jewish revolt. So we will end there for this class number 11, and next week, for those of you who survive another week of COVID-19, we will come back to the story and pick up with Judas's brother, Jonathan, who steps into the shoes of his brother Judas to continue on with the resistance against the Seleucid Empire.